The rust-stained pickup truck wheezed to a stop outside Peterson's feed store in Millerville, Kansas, its engine coughing like an old man with too many cigarettes behind him. Jake Sullivan climbed out slowly, his weathered hands gripping the doorframe as his arthritic knees protested the movement. At 58, Jake looked older than his years, the kind of aging that comes from too many sleepless nights worrying about money and too many days watching dreams slip away like water through cracked fingers. His small farm, inherited from his father 20 years ago, sprawled across 40 acres of Kansas prairie that had seen better decades. What had once been productive farmland now struggled under the weight of drought, debt, and Jake's inability to modernize with the times. The farmhouse, painted white sometime in the 1970s, now wore patches of gray wood like badges of defeat. The barn leaned slightly to the left, held upright more by habit than structural integrity. Jake's wife, Maria, had died 3 years earlier from cancer, leaving him alone with medical bills that had consumed their savings and most of their livestock. Their only child, David, lived in Chicago now, working as an accountant and sending occasional checks that barely covered the utilities. David had made it clear that he had no interest in inheriting a failing farm. Inside Peterson's feed store, the familiar scent of grain and leather couldn't mask Jake's embarrassment as he approached the counter. His feed bill was 6 weeks overdue, and Pete Peterson had been patient longer than business sense dictated. "Morning, Jake," Pete said carefully, his tone walking the line between friendship and commerce. "How can I help you today?" "Just need to settle up my account," Jake replied, pulling a worn envelope from his shirt pocket. Inside were 4 $20 bills, money he'd earned selling his last 2 dairy cows to the Hendricks Ranch the day before. It wasn't enough to cover what he owed, but it was all he had. Pete looked at the money and then at Jake's face, reading the defeat there like a familiar book. "Jake, this covers about half of what you owe. I can't keep extending credit indefinitely." "I know, Pete. I'm working on it." The truth was, Jake wasn't working on anything anymore. He'd given up trying to make the farm profitable and was simply waiting for the bank to foreclose. The monthly payment was due in 2 weeks, and he didn't have it. After 40 years of farming, Jake Sullivan was about to lose everything his family had built. "You hear about old Bill Henning's situation?" Pete asked, clearly trying to change the subject to something less painful. "Bill Henning out on Route 9? What about him?" "He's got himself a problem. Bought a bull at auction last month. Paid good money for breeding stock. Turns out the animal's blind. Complete waste of $5,000, he says. Can't breed blind cattle, can't show them, can't do much of anything with them." Jake listened with the detached interest of a man who had his own problems. "That's tough. Bill's looking to get rid of the animal. Says he'll give it away free to anyone willing to haul it off his property. Just wants it gone so he can cut his losses." Something in Pete's tone suggested this wasn't idle conversation. "Why are you telling me this, Pete?" "Well, Jake, you've got that empty pasture where your cattle used to graze. And bulls don't eat much more than the grass that's growing there anyway. Might be good company for you." Jake almost laughed at the absurdity. A blind bull for company. He was broke, alone, and facing foreclosure, and Pete was suggesting he adopt a disabled animal he couldn't afford to feed. "I can't afford to feed another mouth, Pete, barely keeping myself fed as it is." "Grass is free, Jake. And sometimes when a man's got nothing left to lose, taking on something nobody else wants can lead to unexpected opportunities." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge and a promise. The drive to Bill Henning's ranch gave Jake too much time to think about Pete Peterson's words. Taking on something nobody else wants can lead to unexpected opportunities. It sounded like the kind of hollow optimism people offered when they didn't know what else to say. Jake had been taking on things nobody else wanted his whole life. The farm when his father could no longer work it, the medical bills when Maria got sick, the responsibility of keeping a dying operation alive. Bill Henning's ranch was everything Jake's wasn't. Prosperous, well-maintained, with modern equipment and healthy livestock grazing in perfectly fenced pastures. The contrast was painful but not surprising. Bill had inherited money along with his land, while Jake had inherited only debt and stubbornness. "Sullivan," Bill called out as Jake's truck rattled up the gravel driveway. "Pete said you might be interested in taking this bull off my hands." Bill Henning was a man in his 60s who wore success like a comfortable jacket. His clothes were clean, his boots expensive, and his handshake firm enough to remind everyone he was still in charge. He led Jake toward a separate paddock where a single animal stood in the shade of an oak tree. The bull was magnificent, even Jake could see that. Standing nearly 6 feet at the shoulder, with a coat of deep chocolate brown that gleamed in the afternoon sun. His conformation was perfect, the kind of animal that should have been worth $10,000, not given away for free. "Look at him," Bill said with disgust. "Beautiful animal, perfect bloodlines, gentle as a lamb. But those eyes," he shook his head. "Blind as a bat. Both eyes clouded over with cataracts since birth, according to the vet. Can't see a damn thing." Jake studied the bull more carefully. The animal's eyes were indeed clouded, milky white instead of the clear brown they should have been. But there was something about the way the bull carried himself. Confident, alert, head high despite his disability. "What's his name?" Jake asked. "Haven't bothered naming him. Just been calling him that blind bull. Figure whoever takes him can call him whatever they want." Jake approached the fence slowly. The bull's head turned toward the sound of his footsteps, ears swiveling to track the movement. Despite his blindness, the animal seemed perfectly aware of Jake's presence. "He's gentle?" Jake asked. "Gentle as a house cat. Never shown any aggression, follows voice commands, even learned to navigate the paddock by memory. But what good is a bull that can't see the cows he's supposed to breed?" Jake reached through the fence and touched the bull's face. The animal didn't pull away, but instead pressed slightly into the contact, as if starved for gentle human interaction. "I can't pay anything for him," Jake said honestly. "I told Pete, free to anyone willing to haul him away. I just want him gone. Every day I look at him as a reminder of $5,000 down the drain." Jake should have walked away. He had no business taking on another responsibility, no money for feed, no plan for what to do with a blind bull. But something about the animal's quiet dignity reminded him of himself. Unwanted, discarded, but not broken. "I'll take him," Jake heard himself say. Bill's relief was immediate. "Great. When can you pick him up?" "I'll need to borrow a trailer. Maybe this weekend?" "Perfect. I'll have the paperwork ready." As Jake drove home, his rational mind cataloged all the reasons this was a mistake. But somewhere deeper, in a part of himself he'd thought was dead, something stirred. For the first time in months, he had something to look forward to. The farmhouse felt less empty when Jake walked through the door that evening. He found himself planning where to put the bull, what to feed him, how to help a blind animal navigate a new environment. It wasn't much, but it was purpose. Outside his kitchen window, the empty pasture looked less like a monument to failure and more like possibility. If this story is touching your heart, please hit that like button. It really helps us share these incredible true stories with more people who need to hear them. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel because we have so many more inspiring tales of hope and unexpected miracles coming your way. Jake woke up Monday morning with a knot in his stomach and the immediate realization that he'd made a terrible mistake. In the cold light of dawn, promising to take a blind bull seemed like the decision of a desperate man grasping at straws, which, he admitted to himself, was exactly what it was. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he stared at the stack of bills beside his checkbook. The electric company had sent a final notice. The bank had scheduled a meeting for next Friday to discuss his options, which was polite language for foreclosure proceedings. And now he'd committed to taking on an animal he couldn't afford to feed. The phone rang, startling him from his dark thoughts. "Dad?" David's voice carried across the line from Chicago, tinged with the impatience of a busy man making a duty call. "I got your message about taking on some bull. What's that about?" Jake had left a voicemail the night before, swept up in momentary optimism. Now he struggled to explain without sounding completely irrational. "It's just a bull that needed a home. The owner was giving him away." "Dad, you can barely afford to keep the lights on. Why would you take on another expense?" "He's blind, David. Nobody else wanted him." The silence on the other end spoke volumes. David was probably calculating the cost of veterinary care, feed, and infrastructure maintenance for an animal with no economic value. "Dad, I know you're struggling since Mom died, but taking in stray animals isn't going to solve your financial problems. You need to think about selling the farm and moving somewhere more manageable. This is my home, David, your grandfather's home. It's a money pit that's dragging you down. You could move to a nice apartment in town, maybe get a part-time job, live on Social Security. Stop torturing yourself trying to keep a failing farm alive. After David hung up, Jake walked out to the empty pasture where he'd planned to put the bull. His son was right, of course. Taking on a blind bull was the decision of a man who'd lost perspective. He should call Bill Henning and back out of the deal. By Tuesday, Jake had almost convinced himself to make that call. He drove to town for groceries he could barely afford and noticed how people looked at him, with pity mixed with the uncomfortable awareness that his troubles could happen to anyone. Old farmers failing wasn't unusual in rural Kansas. It was practically an epidemic. At the grocery store, he ran into Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the local veterinarian who'd treated his cattle over the years. "Jake!" she called out, genuine warmth in her voice. "Pete Peterson told me you're taking in Bill Henning's blind bull. That's wonderful." "Actually, I'm having second thoughts about it." Dr. Martinez frowned. "Why?" "That bull needs someone with patience and compassion. Bill's been treating him like damaged goods, but blindness doesn't make an animal worthless." "I can't afford veterinary bills, Rebecca. I'm barely keeping myself afloat." "Jake, I've been treating animals for 15 years, and I can tell you that sometimes the ones everyone else gives up on surprise you the most. That bull has perfect health except for his eyes. He's young, strong, and incredibly intelligent. Animals that overcome disabilities often develop other enhanced abilities. Enhanced abilities don't pay bills. Maybe not directly, but I've seen animals change people's lives in ways they never expected. Sometimes taking care of something else helps us take better care of ourselves." That evening, Jake called Bill Henning to cancel the arrangement, but when Bill answered the phone, his voice was strained. "Jake, good timing. I was about to call you. Had some trouble with the bull today." "What kind of trouble?" "Nothing serious, but he's been agitated since yesterday. Won't eat, keeps pacing the fence line, calling out. It's like he knows something's changing. The wife says I should just send him to auction for whatever he'll bring, but..." Bill's voice trailed off. "But what?" "Hell, Jake, I may be a businessman, but I'm not heartless. Sending a blind animal to auction is basically sentencing him to slaughter. At least with you, he'd have a chance at a decent life." Jake closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders again. A blind bull who was already distressed, waiting for someone to give him a chance. An animal that reminded Jake uncomfortably of himself. "I'll pick him up Saturday morning," Jake said before he could change his mind again. Friday morning brought Jake face to face with his banking reality. First National Bank of Millerville occupied a brick building that had stood since 1923, weathering the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and countless family farm foreclosures. Jake sat across from loan officer Margaret Walsh, a woman in her 50s who'd handled his father's accounts before him. "Jake, we've extended your loan 3 times already," Margaret said gently. "The board is requiring action. We need either full payment by the end of next month or we'll have to begin foreclosure proceedings." "I understand, Margaret. I'm working on some options." It wasn't entirely a lie. Jake had been considering David's suggestion to sell, though the thought of leaving the land his grandfather had homesteaded felt like betraying 3 generations of Sullivan farmers. After the bank meeting, Jake drove aimlessly through the countryside, eventually finding himself at Riverside Cemetery where Maria rested beneath a simple granite headstone. He sat on the grass beside her grave, something he'd done countless times over the past 3 years. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Maria," he said aloud, not caring if anyone heard him talking to a headstone. "David thinks I should sell the farm. The bank wants their money. And tomorrow I'm picking up a blind bull I can't afford to feed. You'd probably tell me I've lost my mind. Sounds like you're having a conversation with someone who gives better advice than most of the living." Jake turned to find an elderly man standing nearby, wearing work clothes and holding a small American flag. The stranger was probably in his 70s, with silver hair beneath a John Deere cap and the weathered skin of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. "Sorry," Jake said, starting to stand. "I didn't mean to disturb anyone." "No disturbance. I'm here visiting my wife, too." The man gestured toward a headstone 3 rows over. "Eleanor Martinez. Been gone 2 years now." The name was familiar. "Any relation to Dr. Rebecca Martinez?" "My daughter." "You know Rebecca?" "She's been my vet for years." I'm Jake Sullivan. Ah, the fellow taking in Bill Henning's blind bull. Rebecca told me about that. Good for you. The man extended a calloused hand. Frank Martinez. They shook hands, and Frank settled onto the grass beside Jake without invitation. You know, I raised cattle for 47 years before I retired. Seen all kinds of animals. The aggressive ones, the gentle ones, the smart ones, and the stubborn ones. But the animals that taught me the most were always the broken ones. This bull's not broken, just blind. Same difference in a way. When an animal can't rely on what most animals depend on, they develop other strengths. I once had a horse that went blind from an infection, thought I'd have to put him down, but that horse learned to navigate by sound and smell better than most horses could with perfect vision, became the gentlest, most trustworthy mount I ever owned. Jake studied the older man's face. Bill Henning thinks a blind bull is worthless. Bill Henning thinks in dollars and cents, which isn't always the same as thinking clearly. Frank plucked a blade of grass and twirled it between his fingers. You know what I learned in nearly 50 years of ranching? The animals nobody else wants are sometimes the ones that change your life. I can barely keep my farm running. Taking on a bull I can't sell seems like financial suicide. Frank was quiet for a moment, watching clouds drift across the afternoon sky. My father lost our family farm in 1952. Drought killed the crops, cattle died, bank foreclosed. Thought it was the end of the world. What happened? He took a job at a feed mill, worked there 15 years, saved every penny, then he bought 20 acres and started over. Not as big an operation, but it was ours. Sometimes losing everything isn't the end of the story, it's just the end of one chapter. Jake felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the grip that despair had held on him for months. You think I'm making a mistake with this bull? I think you're making a choice to care about something again. That's never a mistake. Frank stood up, brushing grass from his jeans. Tell you what, I've got feed supplements and minerals sitting in my barn from when I ran cattle. You're welcome to them. Might help stretch your budget. I can't pay you for them. Didn't ask you to. Consider it an investment in curiosity. I'm interested to see what happens when a man who's lost everything partners up with an animal nobody else believes in. As Frank walked away toward his truck, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope mixed with purpose. Not the desperate hope of a drowning man, but the quiet confidence that comes from having a direction, even if you can't see the destination. He spent another hour sitting beside Maria's grave, but this time the conversation was different. Instead of dwelling on problems, he found himself making plans. Saturday morning arrived gray and overcast, with the kind of cool dampness that promised rain before evening. Jake had borrowed a livestock trailer from his neighbor Tommy Henderson, who'd asked no questions beyond, "When do you need it back?" The kindness of rural neighbors was one of the things Jake would miss most if he lost the farm. The drive to Bill Henning's ranch felt different this time. Instead of the desperate uncertainty he'd felt on his first visit, Jake carried a sense of purpose that surprised him. Frank Martinez's words had given him something to hold on to, the idea that sometimes losing everything was just the beginning of a different story. Bill was waiting in the ranch yard when Jake arrived, clearly eager to complete the transaction. "He's been ready since dawn," Bill said, gesturing toward the separate paddock. "Almost like he knows today's the day." The bull stood at the gate, his massive head turned toward the sound of the approaching trailer. Despite his blindness, he seemed alert and aware, ears swiveling to track every sound. Up close, Jake was struck again by the animal's size and perfect conformation. This wasn't some scrub bull. This was premium breeding stock that happened to have clouded eyes. "Any special instructions for handling him?" Jake asked. "Talk to him. He responds to voice commands better than most seeing animals. And move slowly. Sudden movements spook him, even though he can't see what's happening." Loading the bull proved surprisingly easy. Jake spoke in low, calm tones, explaining each step of the process. The bull followed the sound of his voice up the trailer ramp like a dog following its master. Once inside, he stood quietly, seeming to understand that this journey was taking him to something better. "He's got a good temperament," Bill admitted grudgingly. "If he could see, he'd be worth 15,000 easy. As it is..." He shrugged and handed Jake the ownership papers. The drive home was nerve-wracking. Jake found himself talking to the bull through the trailer's front window, maintaining a steady stream of conversation about where they were going and what to expect. The bull seemed calmer when he could hear Jake's voice. Back at the farm, Jake had prepared as best he could. He'd cleaned the water trough, checked the fence for any hazards a blind animal might encounter, and laid out the mineral supplements Frank Martinez had provided. The pasture wasn't large, but it was safe and contained good grass. Unloading required patience. Jake opened the trailer gate and talked the bull through the process of backing down the ramp. Easy, boy. Take your time. Feel for each step. That's it. Almost there. The bull stepped onto solid ground and immediately began testing his new environment. His head moved systematically from side to side, nostrils flaring as he cataloged the scents around him. He took careful steps, each hoof placement deliberate and measured. "What are you going to call him?" Tommy Henderson asked. He'd stayed to help with the unloading and was clearly fascinated by the blind bull's careful exploration. Jake watched the animal's methodical approach to understanding his new home. There was something inspiring about the bull's refusal to be intimidated by his disability. He moved with confidence despite his blindness, adapting to each new challenge. "Courage," Jake said suddenly. "His name is Courage." Courage spent the next hour mapping his new pasture. He walked the entire perimeter, memorizing the fence line, locating the water trough and feed area. Jake was amazed by the systematic way the bull approached learning his environment. This wasn't random wandering. This was intelligent problem-solving. As afternoon turned to evening, Jake sat on his porch watching Courage graze peacefully in the pasture. For the first time in months, the farm didn't feel empty. There was life here again, purpose beyond simply surviving until foreclosure. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. David's voice carried disapproval from Chicago. "Dad, I've been thinking about this bull situation. You need to be realistic about what you're taking on. Blind animals require special care, extra veterinary attention. You're setting yourself up for expenses you can't afford." Jake watched Courage move confidently through the pasture, already comfortable in his new home. He seems to be adapting well. Today, maybe. But what happens when he gets sick or injured? What happens when winter comes and you need to provide shelter? You're thinking with your heart instead of your head. Maybe David was right. Maybe Jake was being emotional instead of practical. But watching Courage navigate his new world with such determination reminded Jake that adapting to difficult circumstances was possible. The bull couldn't see, but he wasn't helpless. He was learning, adjusting, finding new ways to thrive. "I'll figure it out, David." "Dad, please think about what I said about selling the farm. You could get enough from the land to pay off your debts and start fresh somewhere else." After hanging up, Jake walked out to the pasture fence. Courage approached the sound of his footsteps, pressing his massive head against Jake's hand. The bull's trust was absolute and immediate, as if he understood that his fate was now intertwined with this gentle farmer's. "We're both starting over," Jake said quietly. "Neither of us knows exactly what we're doing, but we'll figure it out together." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Jake looked up at the darkening sky and realized he hadn't checked the weather forecast. Courage would need shelter from the storm. But for the first time in years, Jake faced a challenge with excitement instead of dread. He had someone depending on him again, someone who needed his care and attention. As he hurried to prepare a shelter area in the barn, Jake felt more alive than he had since Maria's death. The storm that night was fierce, with wind that rattled the farmhouse windows and rain that drummed against the roof like impatient fingers. Jake lay awake listening to the weather, worrying about Courage and his makeshift shelter in the old barn. At 3 a.m., he gave up trying to sleep and pulled on his rain jacket to check on the bull. The barn was dark except for the beam of Jake's flashlight, but he could hear Courage moving restlessly in the stall. The bull's breathing was rapid, and he was clearly agitated by the unfamiliar sounds of his new environment during the storm. "Easy, boy," Jake said softly, approaching the stall. "Just weather. You're safe here." Courage's head turned toward Jake's voice, and gradually his breathing slowed. Jake spent the next hour sitting on a hay bale, talking to the bull about nothing and everything: the farm's history, his plans for morning, memories of Maria. Courage seemed to find comfort in the steady stream of conversation. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth. Jake led Courage back to the pasture, amazed at how quickly the bull had memorized the path from barn to field, despite having walked it only once in daylight. "You're a smart one, aren't you?" Jake murmured as Courage immediately located his water trough and took a long drink. That morning brought Jake's first real test as Courage's caretaker. Dr. Rebecca Martinez arrived for what she called a wellness check, though Jake suspected Frank had asked her to stop by. "How's our patient adjusting?" she asked, studying Courage's movements in the pasture. "Better than I expected. He mapped the entire field yesterday and seems comfortable with the routine already." Rebecca nodded approvingly. "Blind animals often adapt faster than we think they will. Their other senses compensate remarkably." She paused, watching Courage investigate a new scent. "Jake, I want to run some tests on his eyes. I know Bill assumed the blindness was permanent, but sometimes cataracts in young animals can be treated." Jake's heart skipped. "You mean he might be able to see again?" "It's a long shot, and surgery would be expensive, but I'd like to know what we're dealing with before we assume anything."
The examination took place in the barn, with Jake holding Courage's halter, while Rebecca used specialized equipment to study the bull's clouded eyes. Courage stood patiently, seeming to understand that the strange woman meant him no harm. "Well?" Jake asked when Rebecca finally stepped back. "The cataracts are dense, but they're not covering his entire cornea. There's a chance, a small chance, that surgery could restore partial vision. Maybe not perfect sight, but enough to see shapes and movement." Jake's excitement was quickly tempered by reality. "How expensive are we talking?" "Probably $8,000 to $10,000, plus recovery time, follow-up visits." Rebecca saw Jake's face fall. "I'm sorry, Jake. I know that's not realistic right now." That afternoon, Jake called David to share the news about Courage's potential for restored vision. His son's reaction was predictably pragmatic. "Dad, even if you had the money for surgery, which you don't, you'd still have a bull with partial vision that you can't breed or sell. You'd be throwing good money after bad." "But if he could see again?" "If, Dad, if. You're building castles in the air. You need to focus on real solutions to real problems, not fantasy scenarios about miracle recoveries." After hanging up, Jake felt the familiar weight of discouragement settling over him. David was right. $8,000 might as well be $8 million. Jake didn't even have $800 to spare. But his mood shifted when Tommy Henderson stopped by that evening, ostensibly to pick up his trailer but clearly curious about Courage's progress. "Word's getting around about your bull," Tommy said, watching Courage graze in the golden light of sunset. "Folks are talking about how quick he's adapted." "It's only been 2 days. 2 days for a blind animal to completely map new territory and establish routines? That's impressive, Jake. Sarah was telling me about a blind dog her sister had. Took weeks to adjust to a new house, and that was a small space." Tommy's wife, Sarah, joined them at the fence, carrying a thermos of coffee. "I've been watching him from our kitchen window," she admitted. "The way he moves around that pasture, you'd never know he can't see. It's like he's got some kind of internal GPS. Rebecca thinks his eyes might be fixable," Jake said, then immediately regretted sharing the information. "Really? That's wonderful." Sarah's enthusiasm was infectious until Jake explained the cost. $10,000, Tommy whistled low. "That's serious money." They stood in comfortable silence, watching Courage navigate his evening routine with precision that belied his disability. Jake found himself thinking about Frank Martinez's words about broken animals teaching the most valuable lessons. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, "there might be other options for raising that kind of money. Have you thought about starting a fundraiser? People love stories about animals overcoming disabilities." Jake shook his head. "I couldn't ask for charity." "It's not charity if people want to help. Sometimes communities come together around a cause they believe in." As the Hendersons prepared to leave, Tommy placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Don't give up on possibilities, Jake. Sometimes the impossible just takes a little longer." That night, Jake sat on his porch listening to Courage moving peacefully in the pasture. The bull's presence had already changed the rhythm of the farm, given Jake something to focus on beyond his own troubles. For the first time since Maria's death,
Jake found himself thinking about the future instead of dwelling on the past. 2 weeks into Courage's residence at the Sullivan farm, Jake faced his darkest moment yet. The bank had called that morning with a final ultimatum: payment in full within 10 days or foreclosure proceedings would begin immediately. Margaret Walsh's voice had carried genuine regret, but bank policy was bank policy. Jake sat at his kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills, trying to perform mathematical miracles with numbers that refused to cooperate. Even if he sold every piece of equipment on the farm, every stick of furniture in the house, he'd still be $15,000 short of what the bank required. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was about to lose his farm, just as he'd found something worth fighting for. Courage had become more than just a blind bull in need of a home. The animal had become a symbol of adaptation, resilience, and the possibility of thriving despite overwhelming odds. Outside his window, Jake could see Courage moving through his morning routine with clockwork precision. The bull had not only memorized every inch of the pasture, but had established patterns that maximized his efficiency. He grazed in systematic sweeps, always knowing exactly where his water was, where the best grass grew, where the shade fell during the heat of the day. Dr. Rebecca Martinez arrived that afternoon for a follow-up examination, but Jake could tell from her expression that she'd heard about his financial situation. In small towns, bank meetings weren't secrets for long. "How's our patient doing?" she asked, though her tone suggested she had more than veterinary concerns on her mind. "Better every day. Sometimes I think he knows this place better than I do." Rebecca examined Courage thoroughly, checking his weight, his coat condition, his overall health. The bull stood patiently, clearly comfortable with the routine they'd established. "Jake, he's thriving. His condition has actually improved since he's been here. Better nutrition, less stress, regular exercise. You're doing something right." The compliment should have felt good, but it only highlighted what Jake was about to lose. "Rebecca, I need to tell you something. The bank is foreclosing on the farm. I have 10 days. Rebecca's face fell. "Oh, Jake, I'm so sorry. What will happen to Courage?" "I don't know. I can't ask anyone else to take on a blind bull. Bill Henning made it clear he doesn't want him back. I guess..." Jake's voice trailed off. The unspoken ending to that sentence hung heavy between them. There has to be another option. Courage has made too much progress to give up now. That evening, Jake received an unexpected visitor. Frank Martinez knocked on his door just as the sun was setting, carrying a manila envelope and wearing an expression Jake couldn't read. "Frank, good to see you. How are you?" "Better than you, I'm guessing. Heard about your situation with the bank." Frank settled into a porch chair without invitation. "Mind if we talk about it?" Jake joined him on the porch, watching Courage's silhouette in the gathering dusk. "Not much to talk about. I gambled and lost. Happens to farmers every day." "Maybe, or maybe you just haven't found the right angle yet." Frank opened the envelope and pulled out a sheet of paper. "I've been doing some research about that bull of yours." "Research?" "Called Bill Henning, asked about Courage's bloodlines. Turns out that animal comes from some impressive genetics. His sire was Thunder Ridge Champion, and his dam was Morningstar Princess. That's blue-chip breeding stock." Jake studied the pedigree Frank had printed out. Even to his untrained eye, the names looked impressive. Bill said he was worth $15,000 if he could see. Bill was being conservative. With those bloodlines, if Courage had perfect vision, he'd be worth $25,000 to $30,000 minimum. "But he can't see, Frank. Bloodlines don't matter if he can't breed." Frank smiled, the expression of a man holding cards his opponent couldn't see. "Who says he can't breed?" "Well, I mean, how would a blind bull know when a cow is in heat? How would he navigate breeding? The logistics seem impossible." "Jake, bulls have been breeding successfully for thousands of years using a lot more than just vision. Smell, sound, instinct, those matter more than eyesight. I've known bulls with perfect vision that were lousy breeders, and I've known animals with various disabilities that were naturally gifted." Jake felt something stirring in his chest. Not quite hope, but the possibility of hope. "You really think Courage could breed successfully?" "I think nature finds a way to work around obstacles, and I think that bull is smart enough to figure out what he needs to know. Even if that's true, I still don't have money for cows, and I'm losing the farm in 10 days. Frank was quiet for a moment, watching Courage move confidently through his evening routine. What if I told you there might be a way to test Courage's breeding ability without you spending any money? I'd say that sounds too good to be true. I've got 3 cows that haven't settled with my neighbor's bull after 2 breeding seasons. They're good cows, just particular about their partners. If Courage could get them bred, that would prove his viability as a breeding bull. Jake's heart began to race. And if he proves he can breed? Then you've got an asset worth serious money. Maybe enough to interest investors, maybe enough to negotiate with the bank for more time. The proposal was tempting, but Jake forced himself to think practically. Frank, what if Courage fails? What if his blindness really does make breeding impossible? Then you're no worse off than you are now. But Jake, I've been watching that bull for 2 weeks. He's smart, confident, and adapting to challenges better than most animals with perfect sight. I think he's got surprises in him that nobody expects. As Frank prepared to leave, he turned back with one final thought. Sometimes the things that make us different are exactly what make us valuable. Maybe Courage's blindness isn't a limitation. Maybe it's forced him to develop other abilities that make him special. That night, Jake lay awake, staring at the ceiling, weighing possibilities against probabilities. In 9 days, he would lose everything his family had built. But maybe, just maybe, a blind bull named Courage held the key to a different ending. The day of the breeding test arrived gray and humid, with storm clouds building on the horizon like an ominous metaphor for Jake's situation. He had 8 days left before foreclosure, and everything now depended on whether a blind bull could accomplish what seemed biologically improbable. Frank Martinez arrived at dawn with a livestock trailer containing 3 cows, each one a test of Courage's ability to overcome his disability. The cows were in various stages of their heat cycles, carefully selected by Frank to provide the best possible opportunity for success. Nervous? Frank asked as they prepared to unload the cows into an adjacent paddock. Terrified, Jake admitted honestly. If this doesn't work, it'll work. That bull's got instincts that go deeper than vision. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had agreed to monitor the breeding attempts, both for safety reasons and to document any success. She set up observation equipment while Jake led Courage from his regular pasture to the larger breeding area Frank had helped prepare. The moment Courage entered the new paddock, his behavior changed dramatically. His head lifted, nostrils flaring as he processed scents that triggered something primal and powerful. Despite his blindness, he moved with sudden purpose, following invisible trails that meant everything to him and nothing to the watching humans. "Look at that," Rebecca murmured, noting how Courage's entire demeanor had shifted. He knows exactly what's happening. The first cow, a black Angus named Betty, was in peak heat cycle. She stood near the fence, clearly interested in the massive bull approaching her. Courage moved toward her with surprising precision, guided by scent and sound rather than sight. What happened next amazed all 3 observers. Courage approached Betty with a combination of confidence and gentleness that spoke to deep genetic programming. His blindness seemed irrelevant as he relied on senses that were far more important for breeding success than vision. "I'll be damned," Frank whispered. "He's a natural." The breeding was successful, documented by Rebecca for veterinary records, but more importantly, it proved that Courage's disability hadn't eliminated his fundamental purpose as a bull. If anything, his enhanced reliance on smell and instinct made him more attentive to the cow's needs. The second cow presented a different challenge. Martha, a more skittish Hereford, had been difficult to breed for 2 seasons. She required patience and persistence from any bull attempting to court her. Courage seemed to understand her hesitation intuitively. Instead of approaching directly, he grazed nearby, allowing her to become comfortable with his presence. When he finally approached, it was with a patience that impressed even Frank. "That's remarkable," Rebecca said, recording notes. "He's reading her behavior entirely through non-visual cues and adapting his approach accordingly." The successful breeding of Martha was even more significant than Betty's because it demonstrated Courage's ability to solve complex behavioral challenges using enhanced instincts rather than sight. The third cow, Daisy, was the ultimate test. She was a valuable purebred who had refused multiple bulls, costing her owners significant money in failed breeding attempts. If Courage could succeed with Daisy, it would prove his exceptional abilities. The courtship lasted over an hour, Courage seemed to understand that Daisy required extra attention, extra patience. He approached and retreated multiple times, each interaction teaching him something new about her preferences and boundaries. When the successful breeding finally occurred, Frank let out a whoop that could be heard across 3 counties. "Jake, do you understand what just happened here?" Jake was still processing the implications. He bred all 3 cows. He didn't just breed them. He succeeded where other bulls failed, and he did it using abilities that his blindness forced him to develop. Frank was pacing now, excited by the possibilities. This bull isn't disabled. He's specialized. Doctor. Rebecca completed her documentation and turned to Jake with an expression of professional amazement. "In 15 years of veterinary practice, I've never seen breeding instincts this refined. Courage's blindness has made him more attentive to the subtle cues that matter most in successful reproduction." That afternoon, Frank made a phone call that would change everything. Within 2 hours, a convoy of pickup trucks arrived at Jake's farm, carrying some of the most respected cattle breeders in the region. Word had spread through the ranching community about the blind bull who could outbreed sighted animals. Robert Hensley, owner of the largest ranch in 3 counties, studied courage with the eye of a man who understood valuable genetics. "Frank says this bull bred 3 difficult cows in one morning?" "All documented," Rebecca confirmed. "Success rate of 100% with cows that other bulls couldn't handle." Hensley walked the fence line, watching Courage navigate his territory with confident precision. "I've got 12 cows that haven't settled after multiple breeding attempts. If this bull could get them bred..." "What would that be worth to you?" Frank asked pointedly. "Enough to make it worth everyone's while," Hensley replied. "Jake, I'd like to propose a partnership." The offer that followed was more than Jake had dared hope for. Hensley would pay a substantial stud fee for each successful breeding, plus cover all of Courage's care and maintenance costs. More importantly, he would invest in developing Courage's reputation as a specialist breeding bull. "The cattle industry is always looking for solutions to difficult breeding problems," Hensley explained. "A bull who can succeed where others fail, who can read behavioral cues better than sighted animals. That's not a disability, that's a superpower." As the sun set on what had begun as Jake's darkest day, he found himself holding a contract that would not only save his farm, but transform it into something he'd never imagined possible. Courage stood in his pasture, unaware that his success had just rewritten both their futures. The blind bull who nobody wanted had become the most sought-after breeding animal in the region. The phone hadn't stopped ringing for 3 days. Word about Courage's extraordinary breeding success had spread through the agricultural community like wildfire, and Jake found himself fielding calls from ranchers across 5 states. His kitchen table, once covered with overdue bills and foreclosure notices, now held breeding contracts and partnership proposals. Margaret Walsh from First National Bank sat across from Jake, her expression a mixture of amazement and professional caution. Between them lay the documentation of Jake's dramatic change in fortune, contracts worth more than enough to cover his overdue mortgage. "Jake, I have to admit, when you took on that blind bull, I thought you'd lost your mind," Margaret said, reviewing the paperwork. "But these breeding contracts? This is legitimate income?" "Robert Hensley's first payment alone covers 6 months of mortgage payments," Jake replied, still struggling to believe the numbers himself. "And we have 12 more breeding appointments scheduled through the rest of the year." The transformation had been swift and stunning. Hensley had been true to his word, not only paying premium stud fees for Courage's services, but actively promoting the bull's unique abilities throughout his network of wealthy ranchers. What had started as a desperate test had become a revolutionary approach to solving difficult breeding problems. Dr. Rebecca Martinez arrived that afternoon with news that elevated Courage's story from remarkable to extraordinary. She carried genetic test results that Frank Martinez had commissioned to better understand Courage's exceptional abilities. "Jake, these results explain a lot about what we've been witnessing," Rebecca said, spreading the laboratory reports across Jake's kitchen table. "Courage carries genetic markers associated with enhanced olfactory abilities and heightened reproductive instincts. His blindness didn't just force him to develop these traits, he was genetically predisposed to excel in exactly the areas that matter most for breeding success." "You mean he was born to be exceptional at this?" "More than that. The genetic combination that caused his blindness is linked to the same genes that gave him his extraordinary breeding instincts. In a way, his disability and his superpower are connected. Frank Martinez, who had become an unofficial partner in managing Courage's breeding schedule, leaned back in his chair with satisfaction. Nature knew what it was doing. Sometimes what looks like a defect is actually evolution trying something new. The success had attracted attention beyond the ranching community. Agricultural journalists had begun writing about the blind bull who sees what others miss, and veterinary colleges were requesting permission to study Courage's techniques. Jake found himself at the center of a story that was inspiring people far beyond Kansas. But the most meaningful moment came when David called from Chicago, his voice carrying emotions Jake hadn't heard since his son was a child. "Dad, I owe you an apology," David said. "I thought you were making a mistake driven by loneliness and poor judgment. I had no idea you were saving something extraordinary." "I didn't know either, son. I just saw an animal that needed help." "Maybe that's the point. Maybe seeing what needs help is more important than understanding why." David paused, and Jake could hear something changing in his son's voice. "Dad, I've been thinking about coming home for a visit. I'd like to meet this bull that saved our family farm." The words, "our family farm," hit Jake like a physical blow. For the first time in years, David was claiming ownership of the land again, seeing it as something valuable rather than a burden to be discarded. That evening, Jake walked out to Courage's pasture as he did every night, but this time his purpose was different. Instead of checking on a struggling animal in need of care, he was visiting a partner who had transformed both their lives. Courage approached the fence as always, pressing his massive head against Jake's hand in their established ritual of greeting. The bull's blindness remained unchanged, but everything else about their situation had been revolutionized. "You know what you've done, don't you?" Jake said quietly. "You've proven that being different isn't the same as being damaged." The bull's response was a gentle snort and the familiar pressure of his head against Jake's chest. Courage had no concept of breeding fees or mortgage payments, but he seemed to understand that their partnership had created something valuable. Robert Hensley had proposed expanding the operation, building specialized facilities to accommodate Courage's growing reputation as a breeding specialist. The blind bull, who had been given away for free, now commanded stud fees that exceeded the annual income of most small farms. But for Jake, the greatest reward wasn't financial. It was the restoration of purpose, the return of hope, and the knowledge that his instinct to help something nobody else wanted had led to possibilities he'd never imagined. As he prepared to return to the house, Jake noticed a car turning into his driveway. The vehicle belonged to Bill Henning, the man who had given Courage away as worthless just a month earlier. Bill approached the fence with the expression of a man confronting his own misjudgment. "Jake, I heard about what's been happening here, about the breeding contracts. Word travels fast. $15,000 for a single breeding session," Bill said, shaking his head. "I gave away what might be the most valuable bull in the state." Jake studied Bill's face, seeing regret mixed with something that might have been respect. "You gave away a blind bull that no one else wanted. I got lucky." "Luck had nothing to do with it. You saw something in that animal that I missed. You gave him a chance when I was ready to send him to slaughter." Bill extended his hand. "I wanted to congratulate you and apologize for my short-sightedness." As Bill drove away, Jake reflected on how much had changed in just 1 month. The farm that had been headed for foreclosure was now the center of an innovative breeding program. The man who had been ready to give up on everything had found new purpose. And a blind bull that nobody wanted had become the most sought-after breeding animal in the region. 3 months after Courage's first successful breeding test, Jake Sullivan found himself facing a problem he'd never expected to have: managing success. The blind bull's reputation had grown so rapidly that breeding requests were coming from as far away as Texas and Colorado, and Jake's small farm was struggling to accommodate the demand. The transformation was visible from the road. Where once a failing farm had stood, now there were new fences, a modern breeding facility, and a steady stream of expensive trucks hauling valuable livestock. The Sullivan farm had become a destination, and Jake was learning to navigate the business side of agricultural success. "We need to talk about expansion," Robert Hensley said during one of his regular visits to check on his investment. Courage's breeding schedule is booked solid for the next 8 months. We're leaving money on the table by not being able to handle more volume. Jake stood at the fence watching Courage move through his daily routine, still amazed by the bull's confidence and precision. Success hadn't changed the animal's fundamental nature. He remained gentle, intelligent, and completely adapted to his world of enhanced senses. "I'm not sure I want to get too big too fast," Jake replied. "This is still a family farm, not a corporate operation." "Jake, you're sitting on a gold mine. Courage isn't just a breeding bull anymore. He's a revolution in how we think about animal abilities and genetic value. Universities want to study him, agricultural magazines want to feature him, and the breeding industry is treating him like royalty." The attention was gratifying but also overwhelming. Jake had received offers to franchise Courage's breeding techniques, to write books about overcoming disabilities, and to speak at agricultural conferences around the world. The quiet farmer who had been facing foreclosure 6 months earlier was now being treated as an expert on animal behavior and business innovation. Dr. Rebecca Martinez arrived that afternoon with news that would test Jake's commitment to keeping things simple. She carried an envelope that she handled with unusual ceremony. "Jake, I have something remarkable to share with you," she said, settling into the kitchen chair that had become her regular spot during these consultations. "The American Angus Association wants to register Courage as a certified breeding bull and feature him in their national breeding program." Jake read the official letter with growing amazement. The organization that set standards for the entire cattle industry was not only recognizing Courage's value, but proposing to use him as an example of innovative breeding solutions. "They want to create a new classification," Rebecca continued. "Specialized breeding bulls with enhanced sensory abilities. Courage would be the foundation animal for an entirely new approach to genetic improvement." The honor was extraordinary, but it came with obligations. National registration would mean even more attention, more demands on Courage's time, and more pressure to commercialize what had begun as a simple act of compassion. "What do you think, Rebecca? Is this good for Courage?" "That depends on what you want his legacy to be. If you keep him here as a regional breeding bull, he'll have a good life and continue to be successful. But if you embrace the national recognition, he could change how the entire industry thinks about disability and genetic potential." That evening, Jake received a call that put everything in perspective. David's voice carried an excitement Jake hadn't heard since his son was a teenager. "Dad, I've been offered a promotion to partner at my accounting firm, but it would require staying in Chicago permanently." David paused, and Jake braced himself for disappointment. "I turned it down. Why would you do that?" "Because I want to come home. I want to be part of what you're building with Courage. I've been watching from a distance, and I realize I've been an idiot. You're not just running a breeding operation, you're creating something that matters." Jake felt tears he hadn't expected. "David, you have a good life in Chicago. You don't need to give that up for the farm." "Dad, 6 months ago you saved a blind bull that nobody else wanted. Now that bull is changing how an entire industry thinks about genetic value and animal potential. That's not just business success. That's proof that caring about something others overlook can create miracles." The conversation continued for over an hour, with David outlining plans for returning to Kansas, applying his business expertise to manage the farm's growing operations, and helping Jake navigate the opportunities that Courage's success was creating. After hanging up, Jake walked out to the pasture where Courage was settling in for the night. The bull's routine never varied: a final check of his territory, a long drink from the water trough, then rest in his favorite spot beneath the oak tree that provided morning shade. "Looks like we're about to get a lot busier," Jake said, running his hand along Courage's neck. "David's coming home. The National Association wants to make you famous, and we've got enough breeding contracts to keep us busy for years." Courage's response was his usual gentle acknowledgement, pressing his head against Jake's chest in the gesture that had become their daily ritual. The bull had no concept of fame or recognition, but he seemed to understand that his partnership with Jake had created something valuable. Frank Martinez appeared from the direction of the barn, carrying feed supplements for the morning routine. At 73, Frank had become an indispensable part of the operation, providing the wisdom and experience that balanced Jake's instinctive compassion with practical ranch management. "Heard David's coming home," Frank said, settling onto a hay bale with the ease of a man comfortable in agricultural settings. "That's good news. This operation needs someone who understands both farming and business. I'm worried about getting too big, too commercial. This started as saving one animal that needed help. Frank was quiet for a moment, watching Courage settle into his evening rest. Jake, sometimes saving one thing leads to saving many things. Courage has changed how people think about disabled animals, about genetic potential, about the value of looking past obvious limitations. That's worth sharing with the world. As the three men stood in the gathering darkness, each absorbed in his own thoughts, Jake realized that his journey with Courage had reached another turning point. The road back to normalcy wasn't possible anymore. They had traveled too far and accomplished too much to simply return to being a small family farm. The morning David returned home was crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that made the Kansas countryside look like a painting. Jake stood on the porch watching his son's car navigate the improved gravel driveway, past the new signs that read, Sullivan Farms, Home of Courage, National Champion Breeding Bull. Everything had changed since that desperate day when Jake first brought home a blind bull nobody wanted. The failing farm had been transformed into a thriving operation, but more importantly, Jake himself had been transformed from a man ready to give up into someone with purpose and hope. David stepped out of his car and stood for a moment, taking in the sight of the modernized farm, the new facilities, and the obvious prosperity that surrounded what had once been a place of defeat. At 35, David looked like his father, but carried himself with the confidence of urban success. Yet there was something different in his expression now, a humility that hadn't been there during his last visit. "Dad," David said, embracing Jake with an emotion that surprised them both. "This is incredible. I mean, I've seen the photos and heard the stories, but seeing it in person, it's still hard for me to believe sometimes," Jake admitted, leading David toward the pasture where Courage was grazing peacefully. "6 months ago, I was ready to lose everything. Now we're booked solid through next year." Courage lifted his head at the sound of their voices, immediately moving toward the fence with the confident navigation that never failed to impress visitors. David watched in fascination as the massive bull approached without hesitation, clearly comfortable with human interaction despite his blindness. "So this is the famous Courage," David said softly. "He's bigger than I expected. And smarter. Watch this," Jake called out. "Courage, come here, boy." The bull moved directly to Jake's voice, positioning himself perfectly for the scratching behind his ears that had become their ritual. David observed the interaction with the analytical mind of an accountant and the emotional understanding of a son witnessing his father's resurrection. "Dad, I owe you an apology that goes deeper than business decisions," David said. "When I told you to sell the farm and move to town, I was really telling you to give up on everything that made you who you are. I almost cost you the chance to discover what you were truly capable of." Jake felt the weight of old disappointments finally lifting. "You were trying to protect me from more failure. I understand that. But you weren't failing. You were just preparing for something bigger. Taking on Courage when everyone else said it was crazy, that wasn't the decision of a defeated man. That was the decision of someone who still believed in possibilities." That afternoon, David presented his plans for expanding the operation. He'd spent months researching agricultural business development, genetic breeding programs, and sustainable farm management. His proposals were comprehensive and ambitious, but grounded in respect for what Jake and Courage had already accomplished. "We can grow this into something nationally significant without losing the personal touch that makes it special," David explained, spreading blueprints across the kitchen table. Courage's story isn't just about breeding success, it's about seeing potential where others see problems. That's a message worth sharing. The expansion plans included educational programs for other farmers dealing with disabled livestock, research partnerships with veterinary colleges, and a foundation dedicated to supporting agricultural innovation. David had envisioned transforming their success into a platform for helping others face similar challenges. "But the most important thing," David continued, "is that none of this happens without your approval and Courage's well-being as the top priority. This is still your farm, Dad. I'm just here to help you manage the opportunities." Dr. Rebecca Martinez arrived that evening for her regular check on Courage, but also to share news that would define the bull's legacy. She carried official documentation from the American Angus Association that represented recognition beyond anything Jake had imagined possible. Courage has been selected as the foundation bull for a new national breeding program focused on animals with enhanced sensory abilities, Rebecca announced. They want to study his genetic markers and use them to identify other animals with similar potential. The honor came with substantial financial rewards, but more importantly, it meant that Courage's unique abilities would be preserved and developed for future generations. Bulls carrying his genetics would be identified and supported rather than discarded as defective. He's not just a successful breeding bull anymore, Rebecca continued. He's proof that evolution sometimes produces improvements that look like defects until we understand them properly. Frank Martinez, who had become an integral part of the farm's daily operations, listened to the discussion with the satisfaction of a man who had recognized potential when others saw only problems. 47 years of raising cattle, and I never saw anything like what Courage accomplished, Frank said. But more than that, I never saw anything like what Jake accomplished by believing in something nobody else would touch. That night, as 3 generations of agricultural wisdom sat on Jake's porch planning the future, Courage moved through his evening routine with the same precision and confidence he'd shown from his first day on the farm. The bull who had been given away as worthless was now valued at over $500,000, but his fundamental nature remained unchanged. Jake watched his son and Frank discuss breeding schedules and facility improvements, marveling at how completely his life had been transformed by one simple decision to help something that needed help. The man who had been ready to give up everything had discovered that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another. "Dad," David said as they prepared to go inside, "I have one more surprise for you." He pulled an envelope from his jacket, not another business proposal, but something personal. Inside was a deed transfer document that would make Jake the sole owner of the farm again, free and clear of all debt. "The breeding contracts and partnership income have generated enough profit to pay off the mortgage completely," David explained. "The farm that was about to be foreclosed is now worth more than anyone could have imagined." Jake stared at the paperwork, struggling to process the magnitude of what his son was telling him. Complete financial freedom, a thriving business, and most importantly, the preservation of 3 generations of family legacy. But as he looked out at Courage's pasture, Jake realized the most valuable thing he'd gained wasn't financial security. It was the knowledge that taking a chance on something others had given up on could lead to miracles neither he nor anyone else had thought possible. 1 year after a desperate farmer took in a blind bull nobody wanted, Jake Sullivan stood before an audience of 500 agricultural professionals at the National Cattlemen's Convention in Denver. The man who had once been ready to lose everything now carried a message that was transforming how an entire industry thought about genetic potential and the value of what others discard. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "I want to tell you about a bull named Courage and how he taught me that sometimes our greatest limitations become our greatest strengths." The audience listened with rapt attention as Jake recounted the journey from foreclosure to fortune, from desperation to discovery. But this wasn't just a success story about money and breeding contracts. It was a revelation about seeing potential where others see problems, about the courage to believe in possibilities when logic suggests otherwise. Behind Jake, a giant screen displayed images of Courage moving confidently through his daily routines, breeding successfully with cows that had defeated sighted bulls, and interacting with the stream of visitors who came to witness his remarkable abilities. The bull's story had become a symbol of transformation that reached far beyond agriculture. Courage's blindness forced him to develop abilities that made him superior to sighted bulls in the areas that mattered most, Jake continued. His enhanced sense of smell allowed him to detect reproductive readiness more accurately than any bull I've ever seen. His heightened attention to behavioral cues made him a more considerate and successful breeding partner. What appeared to be a disability was actually evolution's way of creating something extraordinary. In the audience, Dr. Rebecca Martinez sat beside Frank Martinez, both beaming with pride at how far Jake had come from the broken man they'd first encouraged to take a chance. David Sullivan, now full partner in Sullivan Farms, took notes on the presentation that would help shape their educational outreach programs. But the real validation of Jake's message came from the audience itself. During the question period, farmer after farmer stood to share stories of animals they'd overlooked or discarded, wondering now if they'd missed opportunities for greatness. The conversation was shifting from eliminating genetic differences to understanding their potential value. "Mr. Sullivan," asked a rancher from Montana, How do we identify other animals with hidden abilities like courage's? Look for the ones nobody else wants, Jake replied simply. Look for the animals that are different, that don't fit standard expectations. Sometimes nature is trying to show us something new, and we're too focused on old definitions of perfection to notice. The presentation concluded with a video message from the American Angus Association announcing the establishment of the Courage Foundation, a research initiative dedicated to identifying and supporting livestock with enhanced abilities that might be mistaken for disabilities. Jake had agreed to serve as the foundation's first director, using his experience to help other farmers recognize potential in unexpected places. After the convention, Jake returned to Kansas carrying contracts worth millions of dollars and speaking invitations from around the world. But the most meaningful moment came when he walked back into Courage's pasture and resumed their daily ritual of connection and care. "Well, boy, we're famous now," Jake said, scratching behind Courage's ears in the spot that always made the massive bull lean into his touch. "People are calling you a miracle, a revolution, a paradigm shift. But you're still just the same gentle soul who needed someone to believe in him." Courage's response was his characteristic press of head against chest, the gesture that had become their private language of trust and partnership. The bull understood nothing about fame or foundations, but he recognized the voice and touch of the man who had given him a chance when no one else would. David approached carrying the day's mail, which now included fan letters from children, research proposals from universities, and breeding requests from 6 different countries. The Sullivan farm had become an international destination, but it remained fundamentally what it had always been, a place where family and animals worked together to create something valuable. "Dad, there's a letter here from a farmer in Australia," David said. "He has a blind horse that everyone says is worthless, but after hearing Courage's story, he's wondering if he should give the animal a chance." Jake smiled, remembering his own moment of doubt when faced with taking on something others had given up on. "What did you tell him?" "I told him what Frank Martinez told you. Sometimes the animals nobody else wants are the ones that change your life." Frank himself appeared from the direction of the barn, moving with the satisfied gait of a man who had witnessed something extraordinary unfold. At 74, he had become more than just an advisor to the Sullivan operation. He was living proof that wisdom sometimes comes from recognizing potential others miss. "Evening meeting?" Frank asked, settling onto his favorite hay bale. "Just catching up on how much the world has changed," Jake replied, gesturing toward the stack of correspondence. "Sometimes I can barely believe this is the same farm that was headed for foreclosure a year ago. Different farm, different man, same truth," Frank observed. "When you care about something others overlook, you discover possibilities that change everything." As the sun set over Kansas, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, 3 generations of agricultural wisdom sat together watching Courage complete his evening routine. The bull moved through his territory with the same precision and confidence he'd shown from his first day, unaware that his daily life had become a source of inspiration for thousands of people around the world. Jake's phone buzzed with a text message from a farmer in Iowa. "Saw your presentation online. Decided to keep the calf with the crooked leg instead of selling him for slaughter. If Courage can succeed, maybe my little guy can too. Thank you for showing us that different doesn't mean worthless." Similar messages arrived daily now, farmers giving second chances to animals they'd previously considered defective, researchers studying genetic variations they'd once ignored, and families learning that limitations can be transformed into strengths with patience and understanding. But for Jake Sullivan, the greatest reward wasn't the global recognition or financial success. It was the knowledge that taking a chance on one blind bull had created ripples of possibility that were changing lives far beyond his small Kansas farm. "You know what the best part is?" Jake said, as they prepared to head inside for the night. "What's that?" David asked. "Courage doesn't know he's famous. He doesn't know he's changed an industry or inspired thousands of people. He just knows he's home, he's cared for, and he has work that makes him valuable. Sometimes that's all any of us really need." As they walked toward the house, Courage settled into his favorite spot beneath the oak tree, ready for another night of peaceful rest, before another day of proving that being different can be the foundation of extraordinary success. The blind bull nobody wanted had become the most celebrated breeding animal in North America, but more importantly, he had become proof that courage, whether in animals or humans, is simply the willingness to believe that tomorrow's possibilities are greater than today's limitations.